Hello and welcome to the Business Thorcast. I'm your host, Joel Neeb, call sign Thor. And today we're going to talk about a common challenge in the marketplace. Task saturation. What is task saturation? Well, I'm betting that you're feeling a little task saturated right now. You got that big report due next week. You're leading your team through a project that's not going very well. The dog is sick. The kids need to be picked up from soccer practice. You didn't get very good sleep last night. You're feeling task saturated. Well, guess what? If you feel that way, your teams are experiencing the same thing. So how do you ensure that your team can stay focused on what really matters? How do you determine what really matters? And how do you create time to be creative? In today's episode, we'll talk about task saturation, so pick how you can use our techniques as fighter pilots, Navy SEALs, and Army Rangers to mitigate that challenge. So picture this, ladies and gentlemen. I am 27 and a half years old. I'm flying through the canyons in Idaho. I'm going faster than the speed of sound. I've got 3 wingmen that are about 23 years old that have only been doing this flying thing for the past year and a half. They're young wingmen. I'm trying to keep them from running into each other. I'm trying to keep them from running into that mountain that's inside of the cloud. And meanwhile, I've got 350 instruments and dials inside of my cockpit. Add that to the fact that we're flying against some simulated bandits. We're flying against other aircraft that are trying to simulate shooting us down. And that is a recipe for what we like to call in the flying community task saturation. Task saturation is the perception or the reality of having too much to do without enough time, tools, or resources to get the mission at hand accomplished. But guess what? I know that you also work in a task-saturated environment. I know that even though you're probably not keeping wingmen safe flying through the canyons of Idaho, you are responsible for too many things, it feels like, at one time. It feels like you don't have enough resources to stay focused, and if you're able to stay focused, I'm sure it feels like your team's not able to stay focused. In this world where things are becoming more complex, the stakes are higher. Changes are happening faster than ever before, where we watch the business model go from 7 years to 3 years, meaning we used to be able to get about 7 years of profit out of our products before the competition could step up and start chipping away at our profitability. Now that's down to 3 years. So if you don't have that other product already halfway through development, a year and a half after you release the last one, you're late, right? That's task saturation. In the world where we have members of the S&P 500, the top 500 companies in the world that are leaving the S&P 500 faster than ever before. It used to be that you get into that coveted list and you'd stay there for, on average, 34 years. You become what we call the blue chip stock. Now we know that many of these companies are in there for less than a decade. So they're in and they're very quickly replaced with the next big thing. All around the world in every marketplace, things are changing faster than ever before. So like me, flying hundreds of miles an hour in an F-15, you find yourself in a situation that is ripe to create task saturation. So what do? Do you just throw your hands up in the air and quit and say, well, it looks like everybody's under this task saturation challenge, so what can we do to combat it? Or do you find a way to navigate this task saturation, create a sustainable execution rhythm for your team, be the ones that figure out the critical few things to pursue instead of doing everything at once, and help your team to navigate these challenges? Today I'm going to tell you 3 ways that we approach task saturation as fighter pilots, and more importantly, 3 ways that we've helped hundreds of companies to navigate that same challenge with their strategic business priorities. The first one I'm going to tell you about is our cross-check for success. So when I was flying in my aircraft, I told you that we had 350 switches and dials, right? And I spent about 7 years of my flying career training other pilots. And that means that I would go up in the air with them and I'd teach them how to fly new aircraft. And very often these were pilots who, a couple months ago were only driving cars. And now they're flying hundreds of miles an hour. They're in and out of the clouds. And they're responsible for keeping the aircraft safe. Well, when you've got 350 switches and dials in front of you, of course you don't have 350 sets of eyes. So you got to figure out in each phase of flight what your cross-check should look like. What are the key instruments to succeed? And so if you are in a cloud, if you can't see outside, if you can't see the horizon, then one of the most important things you can do for yourself at that time is look at the instruments that are going to allow you to see the artificial horizon. It's called an attitude indicator inside your cockpit. It literally just tells you which end is up and which end is down. And you're saying, yeah, but Thor, don't you know which end's up? I mean, you look up and that's up, right? How do you not know that? Well, it can be very tricky. Your body can tell you the wrong things. You can be in a turn and think you're flying straight and level. It's actually what happened to John F. Kennedy Jr. and his family. They got into what we call the graveyard spiral, where they were in bad weather. They didn't have a horizon. He thought he was flying straight and level, but he was in about 45 degrees of turn and kept turning right until they hit the water, and everybody on board the aircraft tragically died. So we need to use a cross-check. These are people who hadn't flown airplanes for more than just a few months, and we need to teach them ways to keep them safe when they go up in the air. So we tell them, look at nothing else except for these specific instruments. I want you to look at your attitude indicator, and then I want you to look over at your airspeed and see how fast you're flying, because I don't want you to get so slow that you fall out of the sky and stall. And I don't want you to get so low that you're going to run into that hill or the mountain inside the cloud, so I want you to look at your altitude. And I'm establishing a critical few set of instruments that I want them to pay attention to. And what do you think their response is when I tell them this? The students say, yeah, but I really like this instrument over here. I'm a real big fan of the radar. The radar always tells me where the other aircraft are. And I say, no, I don't care. Stop looking at that. Look at these instruments only. And your teams will say to you, yeah, but I don't really want to start looking at the new products. I really like this old product I was selling. I'm much more comfortable selling that, and I want to look at that instead. And you say, I don't care. We are going in this direction, and right now, the instruments we need to focus on as a team are developing out the new product solution. That's the way the market's moving. That's the way we have to move as a team. So as leaders, we have to establish what that cross-check is going to look like. So whether it's me in the cockpit telling the student specifically what instruments to look at, or you creating the dials within Salesforce or your sales automation tool, or teaching your R&D team what direction they need to pursue for development, you are giving them the guardrails, the constraints, and showing them the instruments that they should be focused on as a group. Remember, what gets measured gets managed. The things that we deem as important and say they should focus on will be the ones that get affected. Here's the most important part of this conversation, though. When I'm telling that student that these are the 5 instruments that he or she should look at for their cross-check, what else am I implicitly saying? I'm telling them that there are 345 other instruments that I don't want them to pay attention to. And they're going to have a hard time with that, because they're going to say, this is another instrument I really like. This is another project I'm really excited about. I have sunk cost associated with this thing. And the hardest thing that we can do as leaders is tell them to stop focusing on those other things and to only focus on the critical few. The toughest thing we do as leaders is tell them what not to do, but it can be the absolute most valuable thing that you do. And trust me, once you provide that clarity for your team, once you provide that focus, they're begging for it. And there's going to be people who get hurt feelings. There's going to be people who wish that you had included another instrument because it's one that they've been working on or one that they feel particularly strongly about. That's okay. That's what leaders are for. We're paid to make the tough decisions. You have to focus your team on the critical few. Don't spread them thin. Don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to focus on 100 things at once. We need to figure out what are the critical instruments within the cockpit. That's step number 1 to mitigating task saturation. The second thing I would challenge you to do is to build out a strategic plan. And if you paid attention during step number 1, I bet the the next question out of your mouth was, all right, I get it. I'm supposed to pick out the instruments that they should look at, but how do I pick the instruments? I mean, it's not as easy as your example, Thor. You're flying through a cloud. Of course, you know exactly which instruments to look at. How do I know what's important for my team right now? I don't even have 350 instruments. I have infinite instruments around me. I have infinite things that my team could pay attention to. And you know what? There's probably a good reason that they should do 100 things. So who am I to say to stop doing those 95 things and only focus on these last 5? That's the value of a strategic plan. If we just have a conversation about what we could do in the short term, what should we do this quarter? That conversation can go anywhere. There's 100 things we could do, and you're going to keep us focused in our silos if you start the conversation that way. If you ask a group of salespeople and a team from marketing and a group from legal, what should we do this quarter? They're all going to talk from their own perspective. The sales team is going to say, we need to build pipeline. That's the most important thing we got to focus on. The marketing team is going to say, we need to create a better narrative for the clients, create a better customer experience. We need to capture that and tell it better. And then the legal team is going to say, we need to make sure we stay ahead of our legal challenges and that we're getting out our data out for that publicly traded company on time at the end of the quarter. So they're all going to focus on their functional silos. So you're not going to get any alignment on that in that team for what the critical instruments need to be for that group. But if you start the conversation about what needs to take place, not this quarter, but 3 years from now, what does success look like in the long term? That's when you can build out a strategic plan that allows you to start aligning the team members, aligning the different functional groups. And when you say to those 3 different groups, what does success look like in the long term for this team? And sales, don't just tell me about the sales number you're hitting. And marketing, don't just tell me about the story that you're telling with marketing. I want to know, what does success look like for us as an organization? And we could do an entire set of podcasts just on building strategic plans. It's actually the toughest thing that we facilitate for our customers, and it's the most heavy lifting, but it's the single most valuable thing you can do. You can go back to our website at afterburner.com and check out some previous webinars that we built. We have a series to help you get started on your strategic planning. So suffice it to say, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with how we conduct that, but I am going to give you some of the highlights. When you do your strategic planning, we're sitting in front of the same group, the sales team, the marketing team, and the legal team. We're going to say to them, what does success look like in the long term? Tell us financially what we look like, because that's going to be the constraints, right? If we're building a dream home, then the financial future would be the lot size. So that's going to define everything else about what our mansion's going to look like in this blueprint that we're about to build. So I got to know the lot size first before I ever start having a conversation about what the house is going to look like. So pick out what your financial metrics are going to be right now, and not just the revenue. Tell me about your combined annual growth rate. Tell me about your profitability, anything else that you think makes sense from a financial perspective. And then I want you to describe your team's culture. And then I want you to think 3 years ahead and describe your team's market and the brand presence that you've got at that point. What are the differences between today and 3 years from now that you want to make within the marketplace? Then I want you to describe what your structure of your organization looks like. And you're going to have a team that's excited to talk about this, because this is so far off in the future. It's going to be aspirational, and all of a sudden you're going to see alignment from the groups. And sales won't just talk about sales, and marketing won't just talk about marketing. All of a sudden they're talking about alignment and things that they all can get excited about, and it's going to be working with the different functional groups together. You get them aligned to this picture, you get them excited about what could be, and then and only then do you start backing into what does that imply that we need to do today. And what I typically do is after we build out that 3-year picture, I'll say, okay, that sounds great. Yeah, what a great destination. I'm excited about that. You guys taking over the market. Everybody has a new job within the company. They're doing wonderful things. So what needs to happen this year? And you're going to see them get a little uncomfortable, and they say, if we're going to do that this year, if we're really going to get a third of the way there towards this 3-year destination, then here are the 5 things that need to happen. You say, okay, that sounds great. That's what needs to happen this year. So what needs to happen this quarter then? And that's where you see the rubber hit the road, because now all of a sudden, instead of talking about the 100 different things that we could do and why my silo is the most important, and we all need to talk about why the sales team should get pipeline or the marketing team should get the narrative, now we are aligned to a consistent vision for success in the long term, and we've backed into not the 100 things we could do or should do, but into the 3 things we must do this quarter. And this is where you start to build alignment. And those 3 to 5 things you must do, guess what? That's your cross-check. That's what your team is focused on. Those are your instruments for the next quarter that you want them all to have their eyes on. Once again, you're going to have team members that say, yeah, but what about this other project, this other thing I got going on? And it's up to you as the leader to keep the focus at this point. We just got done helping out a team in the tech world. They had merged 2 different cultures, and it hadn't gone very well. They started this merger in 2016 in January, and they said, hey, this is going to be fantastic. We're merging these 2 different cultures, but we're going to have an enhanced portfolio of products for our customers. It's going to be like putting together peanut butter and chocolate. It's going to be fantastic. Well, what happened when they put them together is they didn't have a real good plan to manage the cultures and to train the people to articulate this new value with the combined culture. And so very predictably, instead of 1 + 1 equaling 5 and getting synergy out of this, they diluted the group. So 1 + 1 equaled like 1.5. And they had, for the first time, missed their sales numbers in Q2 of 2016. And so that's where we entered the picture. And in July of last year, a year ago, we were able to help them to build out that long-term picture for success. The reason I say that is because they identified their 3 critical leverage points. Within a few weeks of identifying those, their leader, who was in charge of about 500 people, this is a $2 billion sales vertical, has people coming into his office and saying, hey, I love those 3 critical leverage points that you picked. Those are perfect. Those are fantastic. But I just want to let you know there's one more that's really important that I think we should do. And this leader had the courage to say no in those conversations. This leader had the courage to say, these are the critical few. This is what we're going to focus on. I don't care that we're 5 months into this 7-month project. That's sunk cost. It doesn't affect the critical few, and that's what we need to pay attention to. And because he was able to stick to those things, his strategic plan, they were able to not only succeed, they more than beat their forecast in Q4 of last year, and then Q1 and Q2, and continue to beat their forecast, and they're just crushing it. The stock price itself has doubled in the past year. So incredible things attributed to this company. In Gartner's words, because they just finished their analysis, they said it's due to the clarity of vision and the ability to execute. And I'll tell you, that couldn't be right up our alley for what we try to provide for an organization. All right, so that's step number 2. Build out your strategic plan. Using your strategic plan, you'll figure out what your critical few are, what the instruments are going to be for your cross-check. The last thing I want to tell you, to avoid task saturation, to mitigate the challenge of having too much to do, is that I want you to start building that culture of using a common mental model. I want you to create time to be creative. What's that mean? Well, as you build lessons learned from these conversations, and you'll get better at, once you get that focus, you're going to see your team improve. I want you to standardize those activities. Once they are focused on the critical few, don't lose the momentum that you've captured. As you take on more people, and you inevitably will, because you're going to grow as an organization, you're going to need to hire new people and to continue training them in these skill sets. Automate this process. Create checklists. If you learned a better way to sell, create training around that. And create standardized procedures that the entire team can benefit from. What you're doing is you're creating a common mental model for the team to use to avoid task saturation. And the way to think about this is you want to standardize the minutia, right? You don't want a team that's thinking about, well, how am I going to conduct this meeting and how are we going to conduct this sales call? That all needs to be standardized. Create time to be creative on the cool stuff. All the things that we wanted to do as leaders, lead by walking around, shaking the hands of your team members, asking about the next innovative project that we can work on. Those are the things that we want to have time for. And too often we find ourselves engaged in the minutia and having conversation after conversation about how we're going to conduct this meeting and how we're going to approach this challenge. And even though we've approached that same thing many times in the past, we never standardized or captured and use a common mental model to tackle that same problem in the future. The best leaders, think about a time you were on a great team in the past. Think about that leader that was running the team. I bet that leader made it look easy. I bet that was somebody who had just kind of sat back and removed obstacles from the team and looked like this all was, part of their plan the entire time. Most of the time, the way they were able to make that happen is that they standardized the small stuff so they didn't have to worry about it, so that they could continue to walk around and with a cool smile on their face, shake your hand and ask you how your day was going, ask you how they could help, and do the things that we all wanted to do when we became leaders. When we became leaders, none of us said, I can't wait to go tell people how to conduct their meetings or how to build that plan or how to lead that project. We said, I can't wait to go help people and remove obstacles for them. So standardize. Use your lessons learned to build a common mental model to succeed. As a pilot, that came in the form of checklists. Every single thing that we did that could be automated, we automated. So it didn't matter whether or not you were conducting your flight brief, we had a checklist for that. You're walking around your airplane doing the pre-flight, we had a checklist for that. You get into the cockpit, we got a checklist for that. You conduct anything in the air, we had a checklist for that. And you're saying, yeah, but that's all kind of repetitive work, and how do you really we can't create a checklist for my world because, things change in my world so fast that there's not really any automation I can put to it. It's so unpredictable, Thor. Really? Really? You're going to tell me that your world is more unpredictable than mine when I was engaged in a three-dimensional dogfight going hundreds of miles an hour in every terrain imaginable, where there's infinite different ways that you can react to any given situation? There's always a way to identify patterns. There's always a way to automate behaviors and to identify standardized approaches, rules of thumb, to be effective as a team. The more often you can generate those checklists to help your team and to create that common mental model, the better your team is going to be at automating the minutia, at identifying patterns, and creating time to be creative where they want to be, where you want them to be creative, on the innovative things, on the things that matter for your company. Ladies and gentlemen, task saturation was a killer when I was a pilot. Task saturation has literally taken friends of mine because they were paying attention to too many things and not the right things. And I've watched leaders struggle with the same thing in the corporate world. I was at a Silicon Valley tech company, and this particular leader waved his hand over a crowd of cubicles, and he and I were just talking, and he said, I've got the best team in the world. Half of these people went to Harvard Business School, the other half went to Stanford. And he said, and I know that they're sitting in their cubicles right now doing something, and I know it's probably a good thing, whatever it is. I just don't know that it's the right thing. I don't know that it's going to be the thing that collectively moves us forward and gets us to the next level. I don't know that it's the thing that's going to mitigate task saturation and actually help to strategically move our company. Use these techniques. Build a cross-check with your team. Build that cross-check from a strategic plan that you built. And then use checklists, use a common mental model, standardize and automate wherever you can so that you can create time to be creative. Give time back to your team so they're not caught in task saturation. Well, thank you for listening to the Business Thorcast. For more information and to view today's show notes, please visit our website at www.businessthorcast.com. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Thor, over and out.